coming to you again with another book review, and today I wanted to briefly discuss the book that I've just got done finishing. Luckily, I was happy that I was able to finish it till today, and it is called Atonement. Some of you may or may not be familiar with this work. It's actually based upon a movie, and as you can see by the cover that I have here, basically it's the cover of the actors within the movie. But regardless, it is by Ian McEwan, and basically the novel follows the story of this fairly well-to-do family, and in particular, three characters that are considered to be the main characters. You have Briony, I believe that's really how you pronounce her name, Briony Tallis, as particularly the main character here. And she is fairly young, sort of starting off in the novel, and then towards the end it takes place when she's almost, I guess it does mention in the book that she's around in her 70s. But she's basically the main character that is a member of this fairly rich Tallis family. And this novel also involves two other characters, in particular Cecilia Tallis, her sister, and Robbie Turner, who is sort of close to the family, and it sort of explains in the novel as to how he's developed this sort of bond with the family over the years. And also another interesting thing that you have to understand when going into this novel is that it's taking place during the pre and post, as well as during the Second World War. So for the most part, it is following itself within that time period and trying to show you how certain circumstances lead the characters where they are based upon this kind of time period. So the most important thing you have to understand is that Briony's character, although she's a child, she's not the most innocent children, in that even though she has her innocent qualities to her, as it explains throughout the book, there is this sort of judgmental side within her character that makes her assume things that may not necessarily be true, and you'll kind of see this as the story unravels in the way beginning. And she kind of misinterprets the relationship between her sister and Robbie Turner in the beginning of the book. And you'll kind of see how she ultimately sort of makes a judgment on Robbie. And ultimately this leads to her accusing Robbie, or Robert, of a crime. And of a fairly deeply impacting crime. And you'll see exactly what that crime is if you choose to read the book. But for the most part, she does this under completely false pretenses, because for the most part she doesn't really know ultimately that Robbie did it, but she has this certainty within herself that tells her that it was Robbie, even though it was not Robbie at all. Now what you have to understand is that Robbie as well as Cecilia develop a sort of quasi love and slash romantic relationship, and a fairly passionate one, to say the least, especially when you'll see how Cecilia catches them at one point. So it does offer this kind of look into how people within a certain age group can assume things incorrectly between two people that are a lot older, because Cecilia is again a lot older than Briony is. And for the most part, I think it's understandable why a lot of people wouldn't particularly care for Brittany and what she does ultimately in the book. Because again, she does accuse Robbie of a very big crime. It's not like a crime like stealing. It's something a lot more sinister and dark than that. And it has to do in particular with the family, because the crime does involve another family member. And this other family member's name is Lola, and basically Lola is found basically hurt, and Brittany decides that it was Robbie that did this to her, even though she openly admits that she doesn't know whether or not it was Robbie or not. And it just kind of shows the naiveness of Brittany's character into thinking that she has everything within the right in what she assumes. So really you do get a sense sort of her character, even though she does a lot of things that you could say are fairly stupid and fairly naive, but at the same time she is kind of a child. She still is, again, I think she starts out as being 13 in the book. So it kind of does make sense that that obviously 13-year-olds don't have the best judgment, especially during this time period when it comes to these kinds of adult behaviors and adult relationships. So really she does make a lot of assumptions within the book, and you can sense that her character, even though she does feel guilty in the end, she doesn't really, it doesn't seem like she understands the weight of what she's done until much later on in the book when she gets older. So really it does focus on her a lot throughout the entire thing, but it does try to follow Cecilia and Robbie as well. You will get literally a whole section of the book where Robbie ultimately has to go to war, and by war I mean the Second World War, because since Brittany falsely accuses him of a crime, he's released, I think, after 2 to 3 years or so, but then they say you have to enlist now in the army. That's basically how the jail structure, I guess, worked back then, is, you know, you would enlist yourself, and you'd be off to war now because we need soldiers, and that kind of makes sense. So it really does go through a whole section of just him and his experiences there, and it sort of highlights the things that Robbie goes through and sort of how he deals with them. And it goes into Cecilia a bit, but I'd say Cecilia's probably the least of the two that gets a good chunk of time within the book. It seems like it's mostly focused on Brittany, and then Robbie has this portion or section, and again this is divided into parts, so Robbie gets this big portion in part 2, and then in part 3 it finally goes back to Brittany and what she's doing, and you'll kind of see how later on Brittany decides to be a nurse, and it kind of goes through her time learning nursing and doing a lot of work. And ultimately, since this is taking place during the pre-World War II time, you'll see at one point in the book where things are fairly slow, and then once there's an attack that happens and there's all of these people coming in, refugees from being hurt, you'll kind of see how things get fairly hectic with Brittany and how she sort of deals with uh, the soldiers and the people that are basically just dying around her the whole way through that section for the most part. And it does seem to be a novel that sort of focuses more on the ideas of how people can fairly impact a relationship between two others. And it seems like what Brittany did ultimately, as you'll see, creates this sort of fairly tragic circumstance between Cecilia and Robbie, and how they're separated because of the fact that she falsely accused him of a crime. So really it doesn't really hit her hard until finally she decides, I should really openly apologize here. After all of these years, I should just openly admit that what I did was wrong. And then she kind of discovers who the actual person was that committed the crime, even though it's not clear as to whether the person actually did it. But it seems to me, from what I can tell, that that's fairly obvious that it would be that person. And you'll figure out who that person is if you choose to read the book. But for the most part, this book really tends to, I think, focus on this whole idea of how what somebody can do, and within a certain time, can affect a relationship between two other people. And you'll kind of see this throughout the story, and even at the end, Brittany sort of questions what would have happened had she handled it differently. And the interesting thing too is the reason why the novel is called Atonement is, in case you don't know really what atonement means, it means sort of, I want to say it's sort of like repenting. It's like trying to make things right. That's really what atonement is. I atone for my sins. I do something. I try to make things right. I try to make the sin go away, or the bad thing that I've done. And literally, this is what Brittany kind of really tries to do with her life, sort of, is to make up what she did, for what she, just basically make up for her lie. Even though it does kind of teeter back and forth as to whether or not it was a lie, to whether or not it was what she actually felt or believed in. Because again, it's kind of like childish naivete. You could say that even though what she was saying wasn't necessarily true, it's just something that she believed in. It's like saying, I believe in I believe in pink unicorns. I've never seen pink unicorns, but I have a strong belief that there are pink unicorns. It's that kind of idea. That's really, I think, what her character was based upon in the way beginning, when she's young. She's this character of somebody who just blindly believes in things that she feels, and that's within her emotions rather than with evidence. So really, that's all really that this book is ultimately trying to get at, is just this whole idea of sort of trying to repair first starting off as a novel of explaining sort of the consequences of the crime that Brittany committed, and then sort of the after effects of what happens. And it's kind of sad to see how impacting these things can be, especially when you read on and see the circumstances. And I think it just goes to show that sometimes, even as we try to maybe repair whatever we can, in the end it doesn't bring you back in time before the crime was committed, so to speak. So even though Brienne can try to fix whatever she wants out of that whole ordeal that she made, she can't ultimately take it back, because it's something that she did, and it's within the past now. So it's really trying to hammer down, I think, that point for the most part. It's trying to be the story of a crime being committed by someone, and then the effects. The crime of Brienne lying or not really displaying things that she knew, to the after effects of what happens because of such a crime. And I think it's interesting how it takes place during World War II, and in particular England. Is there maybe a reason as to why the author chose this particular time period? It might just be because of sort of this change that's been going, that has resulted because of the war coming into people's lives, and it kind of just, and it's sort of interesting too, because the book actually ends before 2000, before the year 2000, and it's kind of interesting to see how Brienne is so old, and how even these events that she's done way in the past still kind of just carry on with her all the way to the point where she's fairly old. And I think even towards the way end, she kind of, I think she understands, what she did was wrong, and it does, I think, haunt her at points, but at the same time, she kind of shrugs it off. And it's kind of interesting, because you'll literally see how she kind of shrugs it off literally at the last lines of the book, almost like I'm thinking about them and what I did, but now I need to do something else. It's almost like she has it within her memory, and that's all she has, and that's all that's within her. That's all that's within her character regarding those circumstances. Because again, she is getting old, and I think she does have some condition when she gets older that's sort of a kind of mental condition that doesn't make her have a fairly good memory, so that would also make sense too. But I think she tries to make things right ultimately, but at the same time, I don't really know if from what I've read, it doesn't really explain so much as to how she ultimately feels regarding whether she actually does feel ultimately guilty or not. Even though I think there's a certain part of her character that does, I think there's still a certain part that really doesn't, and really doesn't know what, she doesn't feel like she's responsible, because she ultimately didn't really know what she was doing. I mean, she was just a kid. So it kind of does make sense in that respect, that, it was when she was fairly young. But it goes to show that even at a young age, sometimes people can really do things that are fairly impacting on other people's lives, and it's important to, I think, teach children that even at a young age they can still have such a strong impact on the world, and sometimes that impact can be fairly negative. So I think that's really all I can ultimately say about the story as a whole. As far as the other characters are concerned, this particular author likes to give you a backstory of the character, and sort of he'll go off kind of on a tangent at certain points. Like, there'll be this character that's within this certain point in time, and then the author will basically reminisce about everything that's happened within this character's life, or the other characters that surround this particular character, and then go into the present again as to where the novel is within the plot. So it doesn't seem to be so much of a plot-driven story. This is fairly character-driven again, I think, because the characters say more than really the circumstances. Even though, yeah, if you do kind of throw World War II in there and have Robbie go out and fight, that kind of has some important effects too. But it does seem like that the characters ultimately are the ones who really influence each other, rather than the circumstances really so much surrounding them. So, I mean, I think you could still have this take place even at a different time, but there would probably be different effects because, again, since we're dealing with a war here, Robbie probably wouldn't have to go to war, he would just be in jail. But for the most part, I think this book does a good job of addressing these kinds of issues that people may have had, and I think it may even bring up memories within other people's lives of things that they've done maybe as kids that they maybe aren't so fond of, and, you know, maybe how they impact the way other people perceive each other, or how ultimately relationships can be tested because of such an event or circumstance where somebody as a child did something very stupid. And what Brittany did was fairly stupid. But that might be an issue with a lot of people. Hi. Nighty night. Sleep well. You too. Don't know. 7 maybe, if I'm lucky. Yep. Sorry about that. That was my mom just wishing me a good night. And back to this story. So, for the most part, all you need to really understand is that if you maybe don't like the idea of a character like Brittany being your main well, she's not really a main protagonist, but just kind of a main character, you might have an issue with this book. And I could definitely see why people would have issues with it, especially since what she does is fairly stupid. But I think there is this side of people that can get around the idea of the fact that she was a child, and that children do really dumb stuff at times. So that can kind of just be an issue that people would have probably if they were concerned about this book, or concerned about reading it. And although it does follow Cecilia and Robbie fairly closely too, it does seem Robbie's given a little bit more because he gets this whole section, but he does seem like a fairly upright guy, even though he does make mistakes too. He does seem like he's the one who would be someone you could admire and look up to, even though he does have his issues, and he really gets mad at Brittany for falsely accusing him. But But that's really, really, I think, something that anybody would probably have an issue with. And for the most part, Cecilia behaves in sort of this same manner of avoiding her sister. And she ends up avoiding her entire family as a whole because of the whole ordeal. So this is a fairly family drama driven kind of a story. So if you're not into that whole kind of family feud, or if you're not into the whole concept of a book focusing solely just on a family, in particular maybe a rich family who dealt with this kind of an issue, then you might not particularly care for this book. But if anything from what I've said sounds appealing, I think you can find something to appreciate from it. But really, this is all that Atonement's really trying to say. It's not trying to be, I think, on the side of Brittany or anybody. I think it's just trying to tell you how certain situations can impact relationships, and how sometimes a person getting involved can create this kind of separation like you see on the cover here. So it's pretty clear for the most part what it's trying to get at with you. But I really think that's all I can say about the book as a whole. Any questions, comments, concerns, I'm more than happy to answer them. But until next time, everybody, bye-bye.